Hey, I'm Scotty, and in this fundamentals tutorial, I'm going to show you how to draw people and add them to urban sketches like this. This could be very small figures next to buildings like this, or much bigger figures in street scenes. So why do you need to try adding figures to your sketches? It adds scale to your buildings. It also adds life and energy to your sketch. And the other reason is that it can tell a little story about what's going on in the scene you're sketching. But why do people avoid adding figures to their sketches? Well, if you get it wrong, it can really stand out and distract from the sketch. And often we overwork these sketches. It's also hard to know how to do the details like adding a face. So how much detail do we need to add to these sketches? Well, to answer these questions, we're going to go through all these topics. And for Patreon on the full version, we're going to be going through a whole lot of sketching different examples together. Okay, so the first thing we need to go through is the basic human proportions. So we're going to overview that before we go into the details of sketching. So one of the most famous methods of sketching a person in proportion is the Loomis method. So I've put the two here side by side, the Loomis method and my dot method. So the Loomis method has been around for a long time, and his basic proportion for splitting up a person is 8 heads. So you get that head height right from the top to his chin, and then if you multiply that down 8 times, that should be approximately the total height of a person. But it is difficult with these 8 heads to find out where they lie on the body. And especially because when we sketch people urban sketching, we can't see the body underneath here because of all the clothing. So it's harder to line up to some of those points that Loomis would be pointing to. So I've taken some of the basic principles that he had and I've moved it across to my dot method, which is much easier because the points that we're looking at are on the outside of the body that we can generally find on the clothing. So I'm still dividing the body into 8 heads from the top to the bottom. I've just shifted some to make it easier. So we start with the head height here, and then we skip down about 1/3 of a head down to the shoulders, and then we have 3 heads from the shoulders to the crotch, and 3 heads from the crotch to above the foot here. And that foot height is about 2/3 of a head. So in total that's 8 heads, but what makes it really easy is that you can just, once you've drawn the torso, the top part of the body from the shoulders to the crotch, you can just double it down to just above the ankles there. And what the really great thing about this is, if you have those two proportions, is that the elbows are exactly halfway. So 1.5 heads down from the shoulders, and the knees are 1.5 heads down from the crotch. So they're right in the middle of both of those sections. So that's how I break up a sketch when I'm sketching. You can sketch the head first, and then you can go down a bit. You can put 4 dots for the top of the body, 3 heads down, and you can draw that top section, and then you can just double it down to above the ankles there and draw the feet on the bottom. So those 6 red dots here are a really easy way to laying out that body shape. So that's an overview of the proportions of a body, but how do we apply that to sketching really small figures? Is it too much to be able to have to measure all these things as we're sketching figures? Well, I'm going to show you my urban sketching proportions method, so how I use those proportions in a variety of sizes in urban sketching. So these 3 are the examples of the 3 sizes figures for urban sketching. So we have really small here on the left, we have a medium size in the middle, and we have a bigger size on the right. So you can see here that they're sketched in a different way and we're a different amount of detail. So for each one, I slightly modify my technique of proportions, which I'm going to show you. So what's some examples of where we use these? So we can see here in this photo here, these big buildings, and we have all these really small figures, and that shows the scale of the buildings. So you might have sketched these buildings and you want to add the figures, so that would be a good example of the smaller figure that we sketch. And now in this scene here we have some buildings and some shops, and they're across the street and they're walking along, and we're adding some figures, but we want to be quick about how we sketch them and capture them. So this is a good example of medium-sized figures. And then if we're quite up close to people, we're sketching people that are standing or waiting around. We have a bit more time to sketch them, a bit closer. This is a good example of sketching people that are the largest size. So just to keep things really simple for those small figures, we're just looking at the proportion between the shoulders and the crotch and the feet. We're ignoring the feet height and the neck. We're just saying the torso and the legs are equal height. You can even see that I'm not adding hands really in these little sketches, or feet. It's just those top sections of the body we're just implying. Okay, so when you go into medium-sized figures, we are adding the extra things. We're adding the neck, we're adding the shoes and the hands, so adding a bit more detail to the figure, but they're very, very simple. And we can still sketch these quickly by roughly sketching 3 heads from the neck to the crotch and 3 heads from the crotch down to just above the feet, but we're not measuring things too much. And I would be still sketching these without laying out any construction or dot method. It's just a quick guess of the shape of the top section and the bottom section. Usually you can outline these quickly and then add in the details later, but we'll get to that. So then with large figures, we're taking a bit more time. We have a person sitting, or if you're sketching from a photo, you're up really close sketching a person in a scene. So what I like to do here is measure with the dots. So that's that method that we showed at first. After we get that head height, we then can draw 6 dots like this. So go from the shoulders down to the crotch, about 3 heads. And then we go another 3 heads down to the ankles, just above the ankles. And if their legs are bent, we can always use that 1.5 heads from the crotch to the knee, to the knee, to the ankle. And the same with the elbow, you've got that 1.5 heads right between the shoulders and the crotch. But a lot of those extra details come from practice. The main thing is to get the top section of the body is 3 heads and the bottom section is 3 heads. And then you're adding in a lot more detail, the hands, the feet, and the face. We're going to go through how to do the face soon. So based on the size of the sketch you're doing, we adapt the proportions and how closely we follow it. So, okay, so if you're looking at a figure in a photo, or if you're looking at it outdoors when you're sketching a scene, how do you sketch a person? What order do you do it in? And how do you break it down? So you can see here, we have the head, the torso, and the legs. And you can use that from very small figures to really big figures. So when you're drawing very small figures, it's a temptation to block out the shapes like this. But actually that's not the way I like to do it. I prefer to add taper to the shape. So this is actually the way I like to sketch a figure. You can see that there's a taper on the torso when you're drawing a very, very small figure, and a taper on the legs. And also the second thing we need to consider is not just that taper, but also the curve of movement. So some people might be walking and they're walking on one leg and their whole body has a slight curve to it. So we're not going for the straight up and down blocky kind of figure. We have a bit of a taper from the neck down to the ankles, around that waist, and we have a bit of a curve to some of the figures, and you can add different curves to different figures. So I have a simple 3-step process for sketching. So we've got those 3 parts. In what order shall we do those 3 parts? Well, I always recommend starting with the head, because the head is the central foundation for the body in terms of the proportions. So first draw the head, then the torso, or the top of the body, and then the legs. And you've got those 3 things. Depending on if it's a small or a large sketch, you can add in the details around those 3 objects. Sketching a face is one of the most common questions I have with these kind of figures, because people wonder how much detail to put in and they really struggle with the faces. So my general rule, which you don't always have to follow, it's just a general rule, is that small figures have no faces. So I generally don't put faces on very small figures. So a medium-sized figure might have a very simple face. It just depends on the exact size. But like this, you could put little dots in the areas or little tiny shadow areas around the face, and that generally is okay for a medium-sized figure. A large figure like this has all the details that you need to sketch in without it being a portrait. So without it going into too much detail, but it has all the details. So how do we sketch these faces? Well, generally, the medium-sized face can be done in only 4 marks. So when you have the face outlined like this, and you have the hairline, then from the hairline to the chin, we've got to divide the face up into 3. So I start with going down 1/3, and I have the eyebrows here. And you start with the eyebrows, and if you like, because it's a smallish size face, you go down from the eyebrows and you can add in the eyes connected to that just below it. So that's a really cool way, I find, to add in the eyes without them being this separate big blob in the middle of your face. You add the little top line for the eyebrow and then diagonal down to the corner of the eye, and you go across and add a tiny iris. So that's all in one line, and the brow is at that point 1/3 down from the hairline. Then you go down another 1/3 and you add in just the shadow under the nose. So with a medium-sized face, I wouldn't go into the nostrils or anything like that. Try not to draw 2 dots for the nostrils. at this size it often looks like a little pig nose because you have those two dark dots. So I would make it a straightish or wobbly line just for that underneath the nose. And then you can draw the mouth, which is usually just between the chin and the nose. It's a bit hard to get that exact proportion. It is 2/3 up from the chin towards the nose, but I would just put it about halfway and just judge it there. And if you haven't done the eyes already, you can go back and also do the eyes. You go up from the bottom of the nose towards the brow and you just go up 2/3 and you put the eye in there. Probably just a little dot or a line with a dot. But in most cases, these can be done in 4 marks. You've got the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And with a larger face, you might need some more proportions. Just like with the figure, we needed to use that dot method. I've also got a dot method for the face, which is where you go between the hairline and the chin, and you divide the face into 3, those 3 parts with 4 dots. So you've got 2 dots at the top where the brow comes off. The next 2 dots down are for the sides of the nose. So you've got that structure. Once you've drawn those 2, then draw the eyes. They go 2/3 up from the bottom of the nose, and you draw those 2 little eyes, just very simple still. And then you go up from the chin, 2/3 up towards the nose, and then you can draw that split between the lips and a little line underneath for the shadow. So I won't go too much into detail here, but I just wanted to point it out as a basic overview and have it in your mind that there are different levels of detail that you need to add depending on what figure you're sketching or how big your sketch is. Okay, so we've talked about how to sketch a figure, how to do the details, how to do the proportions. But then, once you've drawn that figure, or once you know how to sketch a figure, how do you put it into your scene? How do we make it look correct in proportion, in the right perspective to your scene? So if you're dealing with a lot of people in your scene, you will usually have to deal with perspective. Except in an example like this, when we're quite close and it's a flat plane in front of us, and we're standing and we're just looking at a group of people, you won't really need to use perspective in this one because it's quite straight on and flat view, which is a great way to begin starting to sketch figures, is these flat straight on views. But in these 2 photos, we need to use some perspective rules just to help guide us. So there are 2 main perspective rules that we can learn. One is for when the photo or the view is from ground level. So this is an example of a photo from ground level. The second is from when the view is from high above the scene and we're looking down from maybe a balcony of a building, or we're up on a ladder or on a hill looking down at a scene. This has a different type of perspective that we can look at. So if I was standing and sketching and I was looking at this scene right here, the eye line would be at head level, just like this, because I'm standing and my eyes are at head level. If I was sitting and sketching a scene like this, the eye level would be at waist height because my eyes are at waist height from the ground. And if I was lying down for some reason on my tummy sketching, then the eye level would be at ankle height because my eyes are at ankle height and I'm viewing the scene in that way. And on each of these examples, the size of the figure shows the distance from the viewer. So if you've got it, the biggest figure is the closest figure and the smallest figure is the figure furthest away. The most important thing about sketching at ground level like this is the eye line. Wherever the eye line is, that height onto the person crosses the same point on that line. So if the eye line is at waist height, then all of the waists are going to be in line. And if the eye line is at head height, then all the heads are going to be lined up. So here's a little test. In this photo, where's the eye line? Is it here? No, it's here, along the heads here. You can see all those heads are aligned at the same height. Okay, and the second type of perspective is that looking from above perspective and looking down on the scene. So people aren't in line in this sort of scene. You can see here, they're all scattered up and down the page. So what do? In this example, it's not the eye line so much, it's the vanishing point. So if you can see here, if I find the vanishing point here, and we might already have found that if we're drawing the buildings, that's where all the building perspective lines aim towards, that vanishing point. Especially in 1-point perspective, we can look down the street and right in the middle is the vanishing point. So we find a vanishing point and then we can draw 2 lines coming out of that vanishing point. You can see here that all the heads are all in line with that top line and all the feet are in line with that bottom line. And the one closest to us is bigger, and then as we get towards that vanishing point, they get smaller and smaller until they vanish. So it's very easy if you have those 2 lines going towards the vanishing point to just put figures in between that line. So if you've got a scene like this and you're a beginner and you want to work out how to do it in proportion, I would actually in pencil draw 2 lines coming out from the vanishing point and then add your figures between that line, then rub the line out. But in general, you just know that as you're getting towards that vanishing point, the figures are going to get smaller and smaller. And it just helps to have those guides to know how small to make them as you get towards that vanishing point. Okay, that's a quick overview of how I would approach adding people to your scene. And a really important part of sketching people is the watercolor, or adding color with the shadows and highlights. So I'm not going to go into too much in depth, but just as a basic overview, I like to first put in the skin color as burnt sienna. Depending on the skin tone, we can add a bit thicker burnt sienna or a very thin burnt sienna, washed out burnt sienna. And that can be the basic color for when you're doing skin tones. And then the colors and those shapes, so we've got the top shape and the bottom shape, depending on what clothing they're wearing, we just add a block bit of color. And then the lighting can help with these little figures. If the light's coming from the top left, you might put a bit of a shadow on the back side of the figure and a longer shadow on the ground, just to show where the light's coming from. It should match the scene. So look what you're doing on your buildings or other objects around the scene, and that shadow should match. And then on the side that's facing the light, we can add a bit of white. So you can do that with a Posca pen. I've got this fine tip PC 1M Posca pen, which you can add just a bit of reflection on that side facing the light. Or when you're painting the figure, just going out inside the line a little bit, you're leaving a little bit of white there where the light's reflecting. So that's a way of using the watercolor to show a little highlight. So that's how I sketch figures when urban sketching. If you're on Patreon now, we're going to be doing some exercises together and sketch through some examples of each size. So consider joining that if you'd like to learn more and improve your sketching, especially your people sketching. I've also got this Urban Sketching Fundamentals tutorial here, so you can check that out right now, and it gives you some more basic fundamentals of urban sketching in general, especially when we're sketching buildings. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.